Okay. Hello. Yeah. Thanks a lot for being here. Very happy that we managed to have that great round of people on the table and have a conversation together. So the idea is that it's a very open conversation. So please feel free to ask questions in all directions, and also feel free to help yourselves with the fruits. The reason why we came together is that the Supersalone, which is a special event of Salone del Mobile in Milano, is just happening at the moment. And the Italian embassy gave us the opportunity to bring a part of that event also to Berlin and discuss one question, or probably lots of questions, that we were thinking a lot about also for making this fair. And that's basically the idea: what is the future of fairs? We framed it for this open talk, the tomorrow of the temporary. So I'm very happy that Sofia is here, made it from Milan quickly down. And I'm also very happy that we have an online streaming audience. Hello to all of you too. Feel free to ask questions, and in the end of the conversation there will be a moment to answer your questions.
Notes actually is that we left some napkins in front of you, and please take notes during the conversation because we will collect these as a sort of archive of the conversation.
Yeah, and we are also making a record of the conversation, so it would be great if for the first time that you talk, you can very quickly introduce yourself just with your name, and like that the voice recognition is easier afterwards. Yeah, okay.
Fantastic. Yeah, we wanted to come together to discuss what it means, I guess, to come together, especially after this year, or more than a year now, of a lot of separation and a lot of the fair didn't happen, a lot of postponement of exhibitions. We really saw a different way of sharing content, of sharing design, and I think this led us to also thinking about what are other forms of collective action, and one that came up when we were discussing was the action of just sitting together around food or around a table. And I guess we wanted to start this conversation by thinking about, that's why we have the food here on the table, and again, you're really encouraged to eat, but we wanted to start by just with an open question of what does it mean to come together, especially in this time, and what does it mean to design fairs, but more generally just simply come together. And maybe Anna, I know we were just discussing earlier outside, you could talk about your recent work with students and the space of the digital as a forum for coming together and meeting.
Yes, so thanks, Anna. Yes, I'm actually currently working on a workshop, which will be for teenagers, and it's about influencing in general, because the elections are coming up, and teenagers will have no say in the elections, and actually during up until 2019, the way of how the climate crisis actually went into parliament, they had a very strong voice, but during the pandemic, they were not really, also because of this mode of urgency that was permeating throughout all these structures and decisions, moments, they were not really heard in any way. So we are actually looking now, I would like to explore with them what it actually means to set up new forms of parliament, because parliament is a space of politics, and these political spaces, they are also their architectures. They also speak a particular language which embeds certain traditions and norms into the architecture itself, but also the way of how actually a parliament and the way of how everyone's seated And this all informs the way of how discussion actually works. And I would like to explore with them different forms of parliaments in a more virtual space. We would like to use Mutz Labs actually to look what, on the one hand, that digital actually gives us new opportunities, actually moving through different spaces. What does it mean to actually design a space which is only focusing on one particular question and not on like a general way of actually discussing? And what I think is very important is to use design in a more participatory way. I think that's also the way of how events actually, like, what's the role of a curator? What's the role of the visitor who's coming in? And I think we are now in this moment where all these technologies also actually give us new ways of thinking and creating together, and to also unbuild this relationship between who has to say something, and they're only passive consumers and active producers. So yeah, this is kind of the starting point that I would like to throw into the discussion. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, we were working on a fair, so it's quite specific, but it was also the first time that there was at all a curatorial team involved in the fair. So there is also the talk program and the idea to have it also a place of discussion. So in a way, would be interesting also maybe Markus to hear, because you always build these kind of temporary spaces for a discussion or for the exchange of knowledge, never really for the exchange of goods, I think. But what is it that made you choose that temporary format? So what do you think is interesting of building and overcoming again?
It's a good question. Thank you very much. Also for the invite to be here. As you asked to put 3 words ahead to introduce myself, my name is Markus Bader and I'm part of the group Raumlabor. We come from architecture. I'm also part of the Association of the Floating, which is a sort of mid to long-term project. And I'm also part of the cooperative in Haus der Statistik called Zusammenkunft, as well as the initiative Urban Practice. And I'm teaching in the University of the Arts in the architecture department. All of these worlds of coexisting, collaboration, exchange are really based on people meeting and building up relationships. And I think part of my role in this context is to also bring, let's say, inputs from one of these groups to another and to create cross-links, which I think is super interesting and super important. Klaus Obermeier from Studio Urban Catalyst always talks about, I don't know if that translates like this, the humus, not the hummus we eat, but the humus, basically some kind of substrate, I don't know the word, missing word, composted the soil, the composted plant elements that become earth and nurture, become something else. That in this kind of context where people meet and do their things and start exchanging on temporary moments, really independent of time, something new can start to exist, start to, spread new ideas. It can affect life trajectories, project plans, etc. And of course, over the last year, this was extremely reduced. And I would really say, yes, we embrace the digital as good as we can. But I would still argue it stayed a substitute. Another discussion, not so much focusing on the point of togetherness, is maybe the question of locality, and the question of, to what extent we found a moment to reflect on the way we operate our practice and how much we jump around different places and how many places we can really connect also as a human, understanding that building these relationships is important. And there I would say we really understand also that there is a strict limit or a limitation that we learned as a sort of probably a benefit of this moment of slowness, and to be bound to a more local environment, that we had an opportunity to refocus on these relationships. Maybe that's a beginning statement, a couple of notes that I can pick up on later. Maybe one thing to add, what I also think, because we're sitting around the table, what is important for us is also public space, and the space that everybody can enter and that doesn't have an access protocol. And that this space, we think, is super important to understand that being public is a practice that you need to practice. So basically it's a decision you can take that I'm not a private person going from A to B and using a street as a means of transport, but that I'm now part of a civic entity and I have a position and I want to make myself visible with an interest, an argument, a political positioning, however. And that this this activity kind of became a little bit more polarized and less nuanced over the last year. And I think this is a big lack we experienced.
I think that in terms of locality, do you see this also in relationship to materiality that you work with, and physical materials of the spaces? I know something that Lukas is exploring in his work a lot right now is the production of the material that he uses in his display systems, and something that we talked a lot about in this recent exhibition we collaborated on, non-extractive architecture in Venice, where the wood that we used is coming from a space that he set up outside of Berlin, or what's the name of the town again?
That's quite far from here.
Very far from Berlin, but
Frankfurt.
looking towards a more like circular production of the spaces and the materials that he makes. And maybe you could just share a little bit about this. I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, basically, we are also from time to time building this kind of temporary spaces, and again, like now, that forces immediately or brings me always to the idea, okay, we build for, in this case, for a week time, so we will leave a lot behind. So there, this putting that event into a longer time frame where material had to grow for a long time for that moment and will have an afterlife. We try to have more control and more thought on the before and the after, and that's why we became more involved in having our material sources in our hands, like basically working with forest and in the forest, cutting the wood ourselves, regrowing, and having also a small sawmill, and by that also learning a lot about the material and about naturally also that it's scarce, and that it's something that saving makes a lot of sense because it saves a lot of our time in the end. So I think by being in contact with the material, but the sourcing is one thing, but also the act of building, and I think that's something that you often do as a collaborative act, and I think that's, in that sense, it's a bit similar. And I think also about the question, your material, so probably there is also a lot of thought about the cycles of material.
having an own forest or like a direct relationship to, I wouldn't say source of material, but to a certain part of the material cycle. I think that's super interesting what you say, to have, you know, to follow a tree through a sawmill until it gets somewhere, and including all the folds. I was thinking that yes, we try to have a sort of, you know, approach to understand which kind of materials are available around a place where we go, and not so much bring whatever to wherever because of an aesthetic decision or a style that we work. So what we would do is probably similar but different depending on the place. But I think it's super interesting to extend that way more into the material, where we're not there so much yet, because we were in our practice, as I said, more focusing on this moment of programming also and exchanging. But nevertheless, if you go to floating, it's a very carefully designed place where the choice of material is, I think, I would always say this, the first design in 2018 done by Florian was very much trying to use available and affordable means to create a super empathic space for a variety of activities to happen, and not pre-describing, you know, not design a space that is already limiting what you could do. So there is not a living room per se or an auditorium per se, but the auditorium has a floor that floats and that can go away, and it can be a pool also, but it can also be a swinging dance floor. But we only discovered this over time. First, it was built as this kind of playful element, and then we discover with these things. The material for this were very simple: inflated roofs, scaffolding structures, wooden decks, and some wooden walls. Yeah.
Also, through this design, like a lot of it is sort of used as a ready-made, and that afterwards, after the life of the floating university, it could all be dismantled and go on to have other lives as different objects. And I think that's really powerful. I wanted to ask Ludwig, because in this topic of maybe creating less waste with our exhibitions and not building, when we have temporary events like biennales, like design fairs, how we can construct spaces of display, but in ways that are less wasteful. And something that you worked on with 2038 at the German Pavilion took a very bold stance on this, I would say. It made a very empty room, and where the content was really in the digital space. And maybe you could speak about this and the future you might see in relationship to this and to design fairs.
Thanks, first of all, for the invitation. It's a very nice setting. It's also still, I think, you know, there's some comfort and discomfort in being around the table with people you haven't been around for a long time. And that's also very nice to sort of understand that this is something special that we kind of specialized in over the last millennium. So I'm still a bit overwhelmed by here. So again, thanks for the invitation. I'm Ludwig. I'm a futurologist and an urbanist. Futurology is not the future, but the history of the future. So it's really about past ideas of how we establish the present and how this is being sort of utilized to move forward. And I think, I mean, with I wrote down to answer your question, strategies to sustain the temporary. Because I also think there's a sort of tendency in using temporary means that become very stable, you know, like a very flexible system. If it works, it's not because it's super flexible, but because there's some functions that are so strong and powerful that it actually remains. And the most powerful temporary structures are not disassembled, but really remain where they are and become a permanent structure. So I think when we talk about the tomorrow of the temporary, it's also a question: how do we sustain temporarity? How's that possible? You know, so I think three three strategies that just quickly came to my mind. One is whatever you do as an event, truly and grounded into the local context. So, for example, with his almost village-like structure, but Markus, two projects that he mentioned, the Floating University and the Haus der Statistik, were both satellites for a conference that we just held in Berlin. That was a 5-day conference. And the concept of the conference was really to say, instead of spending the money on building nice canvases for a global conversation, why can't we use the money and channel them into projects that have become stable already, and kind of adapt the concept of the strategy to the needs of the local actors. So in a way, part of the money that we got to fund the conference didn't go into lanyards and I don't know, wasteful material, but it actually went into projects that don't necessarily need support, but that are always also happy to kind of widen their debate and still work on their projects instead of finding something else they need to work on. Then the second thing, of course, I think is very much related to that. Usually we come with an idea into a context, and then this context needs to change according to our idea. Which is like, we do a symposium, we need a table. We don't have a table, so we build a table.
Right.
Why? You know, why? Why are we not taking what we have and then sort of change the idea of how we meet according to the very premises on which we meet? So that doesn't only refer to spatial settings. It also refers to context and to themes and to discussion points. And you know, it's we always have these very weird satellites where people come with their topic to a specific context and talk about stuff and then leave again. And then, you know, it's kind of, you know, it was a pretty large detachment between both because no one sort of listened to the other. So I think this is also something. And the third, of course, that was mentioned in depth already, but still I think is very important is if you do something that you really need to, if you really need to build something, if you really can't think of reframing it, changing the narrative, but if you really have to build something, I mean, it would be amazing if it really, you know, becomes this long-term view of a material in a state of change. And that the material itself is also part of the temporality in which it exists and might exist in another form and changes to another form, and that this also really becomes an idea of temporarity, that it's also the material that has its value in its current state, but had a value and will have, and that this is also always integrated in any of these concepts. First, we always have to deal with reality in the end, so I'm very well aware that this is not easily done, but yeah.
Sofia, may I? I don't want to be provocative, but the words of Ludwig came in here. I mean, made me come into mind some ideas. But first of all, let me say myself. I'm the Italian Trade Commissioner in Germany. My agency, a government agency, is devoted to develop economic relations between Italy and all the world. So we are based here in Berlin, Udam, Ecke, Schubert. If you want to enjoy an espresso by us, you come anytime. And we have some 80 offices all over the world to do this job. We just sent, for instance, a delegation of German architects to Salone del Mobile. They just were back yesterday. So I would like to invite you next time, you know, in April. I feel that future is related to the past, you know, and past is the basis for future, you know. So, I come from Rome. When Romans, you know, founded a new city, they had a leading idea to create the city in order to make people meet themselves. So the first buildings were public ones, the bath, the spa, you know, Salus Peracum, you know, Salus, spa, the court, the basilica. Now we use the term basilica for church, but the basilica in the Roman time was, you know, the place to discuss business, you know, and an open space, you know, and a forum, you know, an agora, a square, you know, a plot, in order to make people meet each other. Now, since 18 months, and you said the right thing, you know, it's quite strange to be again, you know, facing with people, you know, breathing the same air, you know, sharing the same place. How is going this to affect our habits and the architecture and the interior design even, you know? So are we going to have in the future only square screens and no square where to meet people, where enjoy, where to buy food, you know, like in the old time, you know, and the present one? And what about the interior design? Now, most people in Germany, but also in Italy, everywhere, they feel pain at the back or the headache because we don't have nobody at home the proper seat for working at a computer. Or we do that laying on the bed, you know, which is even worse. So it's going all this to affect the future of our habit, the future of the place where we live, you know, the houses, the public buildings, the furniture. So this is my question to you.
Probably, most likely. For myself, I feel a strong desire to return to the squares, to come together again. I think what was so exciting about being in Milan this past week at Salone was just seeing the hunger people had to see design again in person, to meet each other over a drink at Barbasso. Like, this all came back with full force, and I think
Use the five senses.
yeah, I think it's really important, and I don't believe, and I'm hopeful that it won't be a world of only screens in the future, that there will be gatherings around tables and meals, and that we'll have a return to physical space of fairs, but that these fairs and these exhibitions and events will, like we've been discussing, be much more considerate of how, when someone comes to give a lecture or comes to be part of a conversation, they think a lot more about what it means to travel, what it means for the environment, but also for others' health, and what it means for just a more considerate, more sensible about how what display systems we use in fairs that are temporary, and do they have a life afterwards, and things like this. But I'm hopeful that our backs will start to be alleviated. But yeah, maybe that we'll see some interesting design come out that is inspired by the way the home and the office are merging more and more. And we'll see some, but this isn't new, I would say, like the techno bed and the networked home. It's not also something that is just because of coronavirus, I think. We've seen it for a long time, but I'm interested to see what will come. Yeah.
I quickly need to introduce myself.
Yeah.
Because I forgot about it. Just jumping into it. So I'm Anna. I'm an artist and designer. Anna-Luise. And I was at Strelka I researched at Strelka in Moscow, and I studied design interactions, which is kind of world building. I'm focusing on world building and storytelling as a tool to actually also as an emancipatory tool for design. I'm also now, I'm part of a group here in Berlin. It's a salon, and actually the tradition of the salon came out of the 18th century, kind of the bourgeois kind of meeting together at some point, discussing, being participants actually in that, which has been replaced. So basically, people who were in power, they usually made their decisions behind doors. So the public sphere was actually displaced into a private sphere for people in power. And through these salons and through this like getting together in physical, all of a sudden there was a space, a gathering of people possible where they try to also bring a counterbalance to that kind of like, political closed off environment. And I'm now also part of a salon, it's called, and it was mainly digital. So we are an international group of practitioners, artists, and we are now standing in front of this problem. Most of people are residing in Berlin, and we do have in real life gatherings again, but the international crew is kind of expelled. So like you cannot just fly them in for these regular meetings anymore. And we've set up a particular way of exchanging, and there are potentials for collaboration, but it's not there anymore. So I think there is a difference to, like, we've established a certain form of meeting and gathering, and now we are breaking it down again. So, and this is why I was also mentioning the hybrid spaces. I'm not entirely sure how that all works out, metaverses, all these new alternative networks. And I'm also someone who really loves to stay in the here and now and with physical touch. But I think there's a challenge to actually rethink also how to embed the virtual world somehow into it, or like, online gatherings, and bring that together with the physical. So I think that's what is different for me, at least now, in these kind of event structures, which are temporary.
Yeah.
Listening, so first of all, my name is Claudia Banza. I'm curator and working at the Design Museum here next door to the Italian embassy. And I just wanted to express a maybe provocative thought, which just comes into my mind when listening to this conversation. Isn't a temporary in itself completely unsustainable? Question mark. Because from my position working in a museum, which is maybe, well, it's depending on the type of museum, but normally museums are the opposite of the temporary. They are institutions. Some of them have a history of more than 100 years. They are based on rules, and the rules which have been developed through the ages and the decades. And for me, although I love the temporary, when we break the curation jobs simply down, for instance, for making a budget, when we're talking about sources, material, etc. Of course, it's much more sustainable when I, for instance, think about an exhibition which we can show more than a month or 2 months or 3 months. Although I love to show exhibitions for 1 week, but at the end, when you look at the budget in relation to the human or the manpower, to the materials involved, etc., I think it's completely unsustainable. And this is also when we talk about fairs and fashion fairs, etc., with all the things which are involved, like you mentioned it, traveling, etc., etc. I thought just the temporary is completely unsustainable.
See Anna-Lena and Julian nodding. Maybe you could speak about your work and in relationship to this question or this provocation. I'm Lena. I'm an organizer of Klasse Klima, a student-led education collective and seminar series at UDK. And here as well, I'm a cultural theorist, but also an organizer. And
I'm Julia Rosenstock, and I'm in between degrees. I recently graduated at UDK, and I was co-founding Klasse Klima 2019 because we wanted to bring the urgency of the climate crisis into the UDK, into art and design, education, because we just didn't see it there yet. And since then, we also, I don't know, after a while, it was not just, we started a seminar and then we just saw, okay, first we maybe need to make a space to unlearn what we knew before. So first we need to make a space to unlearn our destructive and non-extractive art and design practice. So first we start with ourselves, but at the same time also engage in building new infrastructures that might be are not as much destructive and non-extractive. So that was like how Classic Klima is working.
Yeah. And I mean, design has a historical entanglement with extractivism and with industrial production, with industrialization, and that's one of the main roots of the climate crisis. And we try to unlearn that and also translate into what that means for practice today. And I think much of this is a complete also reframing. And I think the framing of a conversation is also in some way a design issue. And I think what would be important to stress here is maybe 3 points, like firstly, the urgency of action. We're in the midst of a global ecological breakdown. And second, the radicality of transformation. We need unprecedented change. I think we can't even imagine what this means. We must have a lot of courage for this and our responsibility, because I think that many of us are in responsible positions, and we must understand that it is our agency and our potential to really work towards change, but we must be quick. I think that's really important because the climate crisis is advancing. And also, speaking of temporality, I think what we see today is the effect of what happened in the 90s, of what we did in the 90s. So I think we need a completely new understanding of temporality as well. And also what is temporary in an ecosystem, because in an ecosystem, everything has an impact. Nothing is lost. So I think, yeah.
Regarding what Claudia said about temporary is expensive, I understand, because part of my job is organizing the Italian pavilion at the German exhibitions, Medica, and now we IDS in Köln, and so I choose companies to build and assemble our pavilion. But I think this is the challenge we have. If we relate to temporary, the concept of reuse, I give you an example, for instance. It was quite interesting. I saw in an exhibition about Leonardo, the portable bridge that he designed. It was quite amazing. You probably know it, because it's a complete a number of locks that could be put two inside the other one in order to form an arch, stable, and to cross over a bridge, for instance, or a creek, So it could be, it was temporary, of course, because you needed to, go to the other side, maybe. But you could disassemble and reuse. So temporary, if related to the idea of reuse, can be affordable under this point of view. I feel this is the challenge we have to reuse, to recycle. This country is the fatherland, the idea of the motherland, of reuse, recycle.
But reuse is, I totally agree with you, reuse is one of the good ideas, but I'm really concerned with how to transform the museum system into a sustainable system. And we are not, we have the material world, let's call it like this, but you also have the financial world, and you have the world of manpower. And maybe somebody has a solution. So when I have to spend, like, let's say 100,000 euros for an exhibition, which lasts only 1 week, I mean, I could take that money and create something which lasts perhaps for 1 year or so. And the same implies to the people who are involved in building up an exhibition. I mean, and how can you apply the concept of reuse or of circularity on manpower or on the financial part of all these events?
You know that now, since some years, we have in Italy managing directors of the most important Italian museums. The Uffizi is run by a German gentleman, Herr Schmidt, you know, he's the managing director of the Uffizi. And he had, at the beginning, he had critics in Italy because he started reusing the Uffizi, not just as a museum, as a place to entertain, you know. They have a lovely terrazza, the Piazza della Signoria, which was used only during the opening time. He said, I agree with him, why not open in the evening and organize parties there? You pay for it. This was, and the idea comes from a German gentleman, you know. Maybe it could be one of the possible solutions to find the balance according to what you rightly said, you know. You have to think of, you know, making it work, you know, it means money and so on. And the possibility of reuse or, you know, we use in a different way, probably. Not to cancel, not to amend the normal use, but to add something, yeah.
But maybe to link the climate position to your anti-temporary stance, I guess the two things don't really match up, because if the temporary exhibition is so unsustainable, the long-term exhibition is not much better. I think there's some systemic flaw in it. Yeah, I just had this image of you pour a giant, you know, square of concrete, you know, and say, look, this costs just the same as all this wood. You still, you know, it somehow, you know, it somehow doesn't add up. Because I also think the temporary is you know, there's this German saying, the only stability is the ever-changing. And I think there is a certain sense of that we also do need that dynamic in order to understand and feel that we do need to change and that we are still capable of changing. So I think at the core of a sustainable action lies to embrace the temporary. And I know, I mean, there's, if we go on all these different levels, of course, when it comes to museum infrastructure, you know, of course, it would be fantastic if for none of the exhibitions but the artworks are being placed and removed, and everything else, the display system and everything can be constantly reused, and you don't have this giant trash bin afterwards where everything is being put. And I mean, we tried to work with Biennale before the pandemic. They tried to salvage all the material from the Biennale in Venice and offer it as a service to build your pavilion with what is available from the other. And I mean, there's all these, of course, all these problems arising because in the end everybody wants specific things, so it doesn't add up. But I think in general, in general, it shouldn't be blamed on the temporary. I think it's super important that we do change and that everything is in constant flux, because otherwise we also lose a sort of our most powerful tool.
I'm not against.
I know. Exactly. Exactly.
But I think it's different when, for instance, I'm a big fan of Floating University, and I found it interesting. It started as a one-time event, and then you transferred it into a more permanent structure, which I think is, from what I understood, so more or less, let's say.
Yeah, I would say it transformed itself.
Okay.
You know, like, because the group of people that got so attached to the place and its magic, and also the kind of possibilities of this place as a place of encounter. I think this group somehow at the end of the year thought, no, we cannot, you know, give back the scaffolding, make a nice pile of the wood and bring it back to a material level. We discovered something more, also between ourselves. And I think this was the moment when the association idea started to float between these people, that it's not an artist-architect initiative anymore with two from Raumlabor pushing a lot for this first time event to happen, but then, created an energy to carry on. Nevertheless, and this would be a question also for the temporary, or another argument maybe. What about test situations? We weren't really sure if this floating would be, if you cannot predict that enough people will feel this is important to keep. But you can also not discuss it on the level of a concept. If you just have a drawing and an idea on the table and you sit around and you think like, maybe, what does it cost? You discuss it in different terms than when you go there and you have the experience of a living place. It involves completely different qualities of the human also. And in this place also, which is very nice, of the non-human and all the other actors, the frogs and that are living there. And this is a discovery you can really only make when you can go there and you can have an experience. So for us, this was always like for a long time in Raumlabor, this was we hope that with putting out something there, that there could be at least a potential of a dynamics to pick up on and to carry on. So what I like to call that an open-ended but directional process. And what you describe from the institutional perspective, I wouldn't argue with the metaphor of concrete for many reasons, but of course, it's a question of how can we link this need for change, which is a dynamic, to also a need for stability or reliability, because people cannot be in stress situations always. Like you need a certain, and I think this is an interesting balance. And of course, we construct the institutions to be slow and also resistant to certain stress factors. I would say university is part of that. It's not particularly good in being fast. It's good in being slow. And that's also a quality in many respects. But I wouldn't, but to use the sustainability argument is very, very difficult. Like, how do we measure the sustainability of a university or a museum? Super difficult. Like, do we do CO2 footprints as suggested by the oil lobby? We're entering very, 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 very tricky terrains. Yeah, that's sort of a loop of a comment. I also think what is interesting, maybe to just also drop something as a provocation on the table, is scale. And when I come back to this term carbon footprint, at some point I heard that it was coined by people from the oil industry as a means to project the responsibility of this kind of systematic effects onto the individual. I think that's a very clever idea. Like, if I can measure my own footprint, I can realize, like, what is there is a sort of schematic of this is my scale of responsibility. But what I don't see with this is what is the industry doing, and what are other actors doing. And I could enter a loop of permanent self improvement that I will never be able to escape, because my only means of transport that are offered are non-sustainable unless I walk or take a bicycle. And so I would, the sustainability question and the scale question, I think, especially in connection to how do we do this systemic change? How do we get people together to radically rethink and redo? That's also a scale question.
Serial question in a way, but I worked with Lukas on the Supersalone project, and we work on other projects together too. And when working on this project, we also discussed a lot, like what type of materials do we want to use? Are they reusable for a very long time? What is their impact? And what is a good choice of material. And I think as a creator, you have like a responsibility for the physical aspect of, or the material aspect of what you do. So when you talked about how you unlearn things and how you created a new way of working, I was wondering if the physical part is actually really important to you, or is it more like a non-physical work that you do?
I mean, it's mostly a seminar, but we're of course also dealing with the questions of where are we, how are these rooms, for example, open, what is the materiality? And I mean, we've had the seminar, I think in the first semester it was at UDK, and then there was a pandemic, and we're very lucky to have like designers of digital infrastructure with us. So we have this amazing digital spaces where we can have like a chat platform and everything, and that kept us connected during this time. So we had not only like video call, which was data safe, but also like chat platforms, digital storage, and so on. So there were many possibilities for us to come together, but it was an immaterial digital structure, which we ourselves designed.
Which also has its own.
Which but I think it's fully climate neutral, actually. Yeah. There's a project at UDK making sure that exactly that is not the problem.
Your platform?
Yeah. Yeah, it's called Medienhaus Project, which is really interesting. Yeah. And also, I think when the pandemic, when we were going towards the winter semester last year, we had the idea of coming together in a public space and something like an act of civic disobedience and hold the seminar outside and changing public places in town. But it didn't work out because of the regulations changing, but that was also our idea of just coming to places and situating ourselves within infrastructures, also within, on streets, but it didn't work out. And we went to Floating University this summer to do the summer series. So we're kind of using places that exist, in a sense. That's something also my studio that I work with, Space Caviar, is talking about a lot, like as an architecture studio in a climate that we exist in now, like maybe what does it mean to work as an architect in this time when maybe the budget for building is over? Like maybe we shouldn't build anymore, and if we do, what does that look like? So the project that we've been working on for the past few years together, curated by Studio Vedette and Space Caviar, it's called Alcova, and it kind of reactivates existing buildings and disused spaces around Milan, a former panettone factory, and this year a former military hospital, and just renovating, cleaning basically, and inhabiting these sites that were otherwise left sort of abandoned or in states of need of repair. And maybe we have already all the spaces, all the architectures that we need. We have already the pedestals and the scraps of our workshops, and we can work with what's already existing.
Yeah, that's also one approach we are working on at the moment. We are building this network to connect art universities together so they can have their own classic klima or whatever name they choose to use the strategies we used. For example, we at UDK, we started like what was it called? We did like points how the UDK as an institution could change. We worked together with them on changing the infrastructures. They now did a Klimanotstand at UDK. So how did we do this? How did we go into the structures of UDK so that we want to share now? Because it's already been done. There are tools, and that's, I think, a way how to connect people, to show them the immaterial tools that you can use to unlearn and also to change the societal and economic structures around you.
So if I might tie into those institutional forms, which are more permanent, the parliament, now if you're using these metaphors, but then also it's kind of unsustainable actually to have something which is temporary, but then you also have something that's recurrent. So like Sandberg, they as an institute, they've set up the temporary departments. And of course, if you as a educator come into these departments, you have to start from scratch. You're inventing something which hasn't existed before. It uses a lot of manpower, not physical resources in this case, but a lot of, we are also wasting a lot of our labor that we could put into like working on the climate crisis. Actually, if all these artists who are applying for residencies would actually work on projects which actually have a real impact. But during Corona, I've applied to things where 4,000 people have applied to, and there was only one residency actually available. So what happens to all this time that people spend on this? But the temporary departments at Sandberg I found quite fascinating. Maybe they're not the ideal institution, but they can react towards things in a more flexible way. So they are geared towards really urgent questions or contemporary questions, which will not be part of a discussion in the future potentially. So this kind of like seeing the institution, but maybe also a museum as something which is permanently transforming, and also the floating university as something which is kind of like, we always have design in mind that it has a final outcome, but what if this outcome is permanently mutating? It's a framework which is mutating with the agents who inhabit it, which happens at the floating university. And it's something that's recurrent maybe also, because if you have something that's temporary but comes up again and again, and we adapt it towards the needs that we have, then maybe you can also work with materials in different ways. We can recontextualize them, and yeah.
About this temporary aspect in Alcova, or the floating projects and many others, is always makes it very easy for me to react to it, or to work further on it, is that it's so unfinished. So this unfinished structure leaves so many entry points, and I think that's something which is really strong about a temporary structure, that it is, that the boundaries to react to it are very low, and that there is also not a clear script of the end of it.
That's a really good point. It also makes me think about sort of the aesthetics that might emerge at this time. I think through these ideas and this need of reuse and reimagining materials, taking on new meanings, new uses, I wonder if we will see a certain design being influenced by that, certain aesthetics becoming, I don't know, trendy, popular. I think about something like terrazzo, which inherently takes a lot of different materials and mixes it together to become something new, something beautiful, through, in a way, a celebration of waste that becomes something like the floor that I'm looking at below us. So yeah, I just wonder how this might, in the future or the near future, start to form as trends in design that we can see.
Time. How much time do we actually have? 20 more minutes. That's good.
I don't want to talk too much because I'm talking a lot. But it makes me think of Ugarte and the way of how things are reappropriated also, decontextualized again. They are the same things, just put together differently, and kind of hacking and reuse. I think that's also an answer to the climate crisis. We have these materials. We do not need to put a lot of resources back, or energy, which is also one of the main drivers for climate change, into this to put it into a different state. I mean, to put, I don't know, the standing resources to bring them back into something that we can work with, but just bring it together, stash it. Maybe you have to also go away a little bit from a certain aesthetic that we have in mind, a polished aesthetic, a plastic aesthetic, and yeah, go back to things that are assembled, assemblages, montages.
I agree, and I also think that should be combined with more structural work, because regarding recycling or reuse, for example, I think that it's good if we reuse and recycle, but we have to take care that it's not a mere add up to the system and to the status quo as it's currently going. Because if you see, for example, the circular economy, which is a very popular concept at the moment, the problem is that alongside that trend, we still have an increase of consumption and of production. And if we do not cut this increase, we will, it's happening in parallel. So there's circular economy advancing on one hand, and then there's an increase in consumption on the other hand. And so we must at the same time, if we think about circular objects and products, we must at the same time also think about structures. So design is not only working on an object or a place or a site, but also working on a structure and working on political structures, economic structures. And I also think that, speaking of trade fairs, that would also mean that here we cannot only maybe present new circular objects or ecologically neutral objects, but that we must also understand it as places where we can exchange new economic frameworks and new ideas for how to organize society as a whole. Because this is we need this two-folded approach to be effective, I think. I think to this point, it's about looking beyond just the object or the design of a space, but viewing all of these externalities, all of the space that material came from, the labor, the bodies that made that object, how far it traveled, and including all of that in the design story that we tell and in the object itself, and making that really visible and very clear to the consumer and to other designers. And I think once we start seeing all of those externalities, it will really change the way we consume or look at design.
Or how desires actually manifest. Yeah. I think if we talk about fairs, that's the main place where desire is created. So design and desire. And
we talk about fair as something static, and I think it's also, it's a sort of container term that is also completely different now than probably some time ago. I guess the fair is also changing in this respect, that it's not only or not primarily maybe about displaying objects in cases and making trade contracts around these, buying new machines. But it's because knowledge is, these kind of contracts can be done in another way. So I think there is a shift towards this building of relationships, and also the exchange of experiences, of styles of doing, and of kind of making different practices touch, maybe. At least I like to see it like that.
Yeah, at Supersalone, that was also this year quite an experiment, I would say, with this format of Salone. But of course, in Milan, you have all those other exhibitions happening at the same time. So the answer for what is sustainable will, for the smaller exhibitions, be a whole different one than for the fair. So scale is, in that sense, super crucial, and answers will, depending on the scale, be very different. But within the fair, I'm super happy that there is this very strong, I think, program of talks every day, which we will also be part of in a bit. There was also the first time in the fair on eye level with the exhibitors for a range of young designers, like free booths. So I think it's about 50 designers that had the possibility to show their work for the first time without any investment, which I also think is really interesting, thinking about the fair also thinking about its own future, so making it more open to the new generation and allowing all those new voices inside of the own system. So I think this plus a very prominent graduation show that was this year part of the fair are also from inside the organization really strong signals that there is a strong will to change and update that format. But of course, there will be much more work needed on that. And it will also be really interesting to, after that first experiment, also hear how it went for the exhibitors and for how this more democratic mix actually felt like. So far, we only heard quite positive.
Lukas, yeah?
Yeah.
I'm not wrong, yeah, because actually the Supersalone, the Salone, takes place inside the exhibition ground and outside all the city of Milan. I had to tell you that we are guinea pigs. We are experiments, because this is the first time we are trying to have the Fuorisalone, not only in Milan, but in other countries. So this is the first experiment. Welcome to the labor. So if it works, and I see it's working, it could be next year, April, possibly. It could be taking place in other countries around the world the same day. Discussing, talking, exchanging ideas. Let's a virtual forum around the world.
Francesco, I wanted to bring another word into the discussion since you are the director of a trade agency. And I think the impact of what we do is also very important, and who is say something. And I think the economical parties have much more impact in what they say in terms of lobbyism, and they can also influence politics. And I just wanted to know from you since you just told me that you're working since many years for this agency, how has it changed within your field of operation and the notion of sustainability? And so could you say something about this?
It's a hard question. What to say? I can hear my personal experience about Germany, because my first mandate here was almost 30 years ago, just after the Wende, and now again. So I see the attitude we have now, trying to tighten, deepen, or create the relation between people, between German companies, or in this case, architects and Italian companies, So maybe 30 years ago, what we tried to do was to offer what we had. And very often it was a question of take it or leave it, the attitude changed a lot, So adapt what you can do to the need of people, to the changing need. Well, when you say temporary means stability, I totally agree. We talk about evolution, not revolution, like the English philosophy would say, things change continuously to stay. Otherwise, we would be over since centuries, So, to adapt our capacity to the need, the change every time. This is, I feel, the challenge we have. We try our best to do that, So listening more than talking. This is the key to success, I think, to understand what's changing in the society, in the country, the attitude of the people, and try to transform the knowledge you had into services or products. The example I gave you, so my wife is going to have physiotherapy. Like most people in this country and everywhere, and she works from remote, because we didn't have a proper chair at all. Who has got an office chair at all? Yeah, the government in Germany gave 1,500 euros last year to face this new need. So it means we had to think that the house becomes to be an office, and the office should be a house as well. It's not so different now. In my office, the first thing here in Berlin, the first thing I did was to buy. I don't know the English for the biliardino. A soccer table. Yeah. And because the office should be, in my view, a place where you enjoy and you relax also, because if you're under stress, you make mistakes, So this was a bit from what I observed in this year, this decade. Oh my God. Changing, listening to understand the real needs of people, the real need, not just something which lasts a while and that's it. No, this is my experience.
Oh, thank you. I found it interesting you say listening more, and just, I mean,
This is, I beg your pardon, madam. This is what my teacher of art told me once when I was in my school, in high school in Rome. He told me, Francesco, you know why do we have 2 ears and 1 mouth? Because we have to listen more than we talk. I totally agree with that gentleman. I beg your pardon, madam.
No. I just wonder, for instance, we are sitting here at this table, and I totally agree with what you were saying, Anna and Julia. And I think that they represent also the young generation. And I thought it could perhaps be interesting. I mean, I'm not in your position, but I invite the younger generation to the museum and ask them, what could we transform and what is your opinion about this and that? And I think because trade is has a super influence, a huge impact on changing the society. And couldn't it be interesting to invite those 2 ladies or more of them to have an insight into how your institution is working, and maybe also, because you were saying listen to them, what their ideas are about changing and sustainability and temporary, etc. I think this could be super interesting.
Yeah, definitely. So you could be our guest in the next trip we organize to Italy regarding this aspect of this sector. Yeah, why not?
But from
Just drop me your contacts. I hold you to the practice. Yeah.
Now we're bringing together these minds because I think we wanted each of you to meet each other also, and I think this can be the beginning of many interesting conversations, and like you said, future trips to Design Week, to Italy in the future, and we can, I think, expand the Salone across country lines, and I think that's very exciting. Yeah.
I think if listen to us, like that's of course a nice offer, but also maybe listen to the people that actually suffer from the climate crisis, and what are, like, where does the industry, maybe like what does the industry also rely on? I think that's also a really important question to bring to the table, and also to ask who maybe doesn't sit at this table while we discuss this.
Yeah, well, I think the time is over. Right? So, well, trying to. Yeah, thanks a lot. So it's a pity, but yeah, we are at the end of the time. We still have a lot of fruits. Yeah.
Maybe.
No, thank you so much that you took the time with us, and I'm super glad that the conversation was indeed just jumping around the table. We will have some more time later for some private talks, or now we can also listen to the talk and be connected to the Salone directly. Yeah, thank you so much for being here, and
Yes, thank you. Hope this is the beginning of many more conversations, and again, a return to coming together, which I think we all missed a lot. So I'm really happy to be traveling again and to be seeing friends again, eating together. Thank you.
Thank you.